Welcome to this Asia Global podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. This podcast is part of our Meet the Author series, where we have a conversation with contributors to AsiaGlobal Online and other publications of the Institute. Joining me now from Hong Kong is Phoebe Ewen. She's program director at the Mekong Club, a Hong Kong-based anti-slavery nonprofit group engaging with businesses, coordinating and managing projects across the 4 working groups, writing and conducting research. She holds a master's degree with honors in international relations from the University of Nottingham in the UK. Joining me from Macau is Thinyane. She's principal research fellow with the migrant technology team at the United Nations University Institute in Macau, where she leads the migrant tech research project. She has a PhD in computer science from the University of South Australia. And now also in Hong Kong is Sophie Zinser. She is research assistant with the migrant technology team at the United Nations University Institute in Macau. And she holds a master's degree in global affairs from Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University in China, which means she was a Schwarzman scholar. So welcome to you all. Welcome, Phoebe, Hannah, and Sophie.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Great. Now, your article, which is trending on AsiaGlobal Online, is titled Technology as Amplifier, Giving Workers a Voice in Social Compliance Audits. Modern slavery affects virtually every supply chain in the world, from fishing to manufacturing, from hospitality to retail. The gap between the estimated number of victims and the number who are identified and helped suggests substantial failings in the current victim identification processes. Now, innovative technology such as the social compliance application Apprise Audit, which we'll talk about, could make a big difference. And that's your argument in your article. So I'm wondering if I could start with you, Phoebe. Tell us about how you got into this idea, which I think is fantastic. I mean, you're basically melding a task, an important task, which is social compliance auditing to understand a really serious social problem, and that's modern day slavery. And you bring in the technology to deal with it. In other words, to up the game in terms of social compliance audit, which previously might be done with, that people might have some devices or such, but it was much more difficult task. And now there are reasons why this new technology that you have developed with Hannah and her team is now sort of a game changer in the social compliance audit task. So tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for such a kind introduction, and thank you for having us here today. Certainly very happy to talk about this article and also the Apprise Audit project, which is a collaboration between ourselves at Mekong Club and with United Nations University on Macau. So it's great that we can all be here together today to talk about this project. So, I mean, in terms of kind of how we came to this space and how we came to decide to really look to tackle the issues within the social auditing process. I mean, Mekong Club, we work very, very closely with the private sector. So we work with companies from financial service providers to hospitality providers to retailers to manufacturers. And we've been working with these companies for years. They come to us, we bring them together in working groups, we have conversations all around the issue of modern slavery and what can better be done to rid the world of this horrendous crime. as you alluded to, I mean, out of the 40 million victims that we estimate to be out there currently, we're only really successfully identifying around 0.2% of those victims every single year, which is just incredibly embarrassing. And I mean, it certainly doesn't speak to the effort that's going into this process, but it really highlights the fact that there must be some fundamental issues in the way that we're approaching the victim identification process that needs to change. So through our conversations with these companies, with our stakeholders, we came to kind of come across the social audit process as one fundamental tool that people are using, certainly using to try to identify victims of modern slavery by physically going into factories and going into locations, talking to workers. Certainly this is a tool that's used across the board. However, there's some kind of real fundamental issues within that process that need to be addressed. Issues of workers feeling like they can't speak freely, if they're potentially being interviewed as part of the audit, you know, in a room with their managers or with their peers. As I'm sure you can imagine, it's quite hard to speak freely on issues, especially issues so sensitive as modern slavery and labor exploitation when you're being watched by your superiors, as well as language barriers. Social auditors simply don't speak the languages of the workers that they're trying to speak to, which can mean that certain workers are never selected for interview because the language that they speak is simply not spoken by the social audit community in that country. As well as a real lack of consistency when it comes to data collection. So different companies are asking different questions. They're identifying different elements that may allude to modern slavery, but there's no consistency. And we kind of mapping against the kind of indicators that are out there of modern slavery, such as the ILO indicators, we found that pretty much across the board, each social audit was not hitting all of those indicators. So we weren't able to confidently say that the social audit process was really covering all of the various issues that we would bring into under the modern slavery umbrella. So this gives a bit of a background, I guess, in terms of why we decided to embark on this project. And we cover this more within the article on AsiaGlobal Online, which your listeners can certainly go read. And then kind of alongside that, we found of the over 200 auditors that we spoke to, over 92% of them were very, very open to using technology in this space. So there's definitely an enthusiasm to begin to apply these more kind of innovative technologies in this space, but a real gap in terms of the technologies that are out there, which is how we came to develop the Apprise Audit platform in the first place.
Great, thank you. Hannah, so I'm sitting here at University of Hong Kong, and you know, ivory tower and all that sort of thing. People say, well, people just like read the books, maybe do some online research and nose to the grindstone. But here you are, I mean, a serious academic, but yet, you know, you're doing something concrete and you come up with something that actually does something for the here and now. Now, I don't want to dismiss academics per se, but tell us a bit how you came to create this partnership with the Mekong Club and you know, which really is I think it's thrilling, this idea that academic work can also, and research work can also be involved with people that are out there, because you guys are out there as well. People don't appreciate that a lot of academics is about field work and research.
Yeah, and definitely we have that same idea in computer science. So my background is computer science. You might think a computer scientist sits in front of their computer and just programs the whole time. But there's a field or a branch of computer science called applied computing, and our discipline is ICT for development. If we think of technology, any technology is developed with the perceptions of the developer in mind. They're the ones who develop and make the decisions about what counts and what doesn't count. So in ICT for development, we say that we need to make sure that we acknowledge the expertise of the people in the field. So this research project, Apprise Audit, actually comes from a different project called Apprise that we started with Mekong Club in 2017, beginning of 2017, where we went to Thailand and we met with a group of 32 stakeholders to understand from people who already assess working conditions. So that's police officers, NGOs, international organizations like IOM, ILO, as well as survivors of trafficking in shelters themselves, to say, what problems did you face in victim identification and what goes wrong? Because we need to understand that if we're going to help you. So we say it's like a problem-centric approach. So we do a large needs assessment to understand what are the problems. Then we do brainstorming with the target demographic to understand how they believe they could use technology to overcome the problems that they face. So really, it's this grounded approach that we value and acknowledge the expertise of people in the field, and we work with them to design and co-develop and co-evaluate software. We use a cyclic approach to evaluation. So we make some kind of prototype, we work with them, we test it, we tweak it, we go back, and it goes over for a year. We were out in and out of Thailand every 1 or 2 months at the very beginning, until we developed a system where we really were very confident we represented the values and needs of the people in the field. And so we started off in fishing and in sex work with NGOs in Thailand, as well as wanting to get into manufacturing. We knew that auditors were a different bunch, and so they might have different needs. So after we were happy and we kind of let go of our baby so that people could use it in the field in Thailand, we were like, okay, I think we're actually ready to look at what auditors need, because it might be quite different to what an NGO or a police officer needs in the field as well. So that's when we kind of branched from Apprise to Apprise Audit to very specifically focus on the requirements of this demographic. So you know that this is, we build systems, right? That's part of our work, but also there's all of the research component that goes on behind it.
Yeah, interesting. Now, Sophie, I understand that you're here in Hong Kong and you're essentially doing some liaising with some of the clients of this operation. Is that what your role, or you've been doing?
So given the Mekong Club's, well, thank you so much for having us, Al, and given the Mekong Club's incredible connections with brands, we're using their network and Phoebe's generosity to kind of get the word out about what we do. My role is mainly to be parsing and sort of writing reports and doing the research back end on all the incredible case studies and field interviews and sort of data that we've collected, as well as launching into different tracks that we're thinking about for the future of Apprise. So as separate from Apprise Audit, seeing for gaps here in Hong Kong of ways that we can be bringing Apprise here. So that's my role based in Hong Kong.
Great. Now, then this is a question really for all three of you, anyone who wants to answer in any which way. So what have you learned now since implementing the Apprise Audit, and what lessons are you then taking for future use of this application, as well as the development of other applications and the use of other technologies?
I can certainly answer this from a kind of private sector brand perspective. I think certainly it's been really interesting to see how a relatively kind of simple solution can be developed and applied to these problems that have been so prevalent for so long within the industry. And, you know, they're kind of constantly used as excuses for kind of why the social audit process is maybe failing to identify victims. In developing this fairly straightforward solution, it's been really awesome to see how excited the brands have been getting, how kind of impressed they are that actually these problems can be solved. We don't need to accept things the way that they are. I think that's been a really, really important lesson, not just for this project, but just more generally for the anti-slavery world as a whole. Yes, there are so many barriers. Yes, there are so many challenges. But if we collaborate, if we work together, if we apply ourselves, we can develop these solutions that can ultimately create change. So that's been awesome from our side.
Hannah, did you have?
Yeah. From our side, one of the really interesting things that we saw was due to the fact that we were going to visit in the beginning, going from port to port in Thailand, looking at exploitation and fishing, and we'd see practices of exploitation change over time. If you think of exploitation as a game of cat and mouse between your exploiters and your inspectorates. So the exploiters find a loophole, they start exploiting people in a particular way, then the inspectorate catch up and they're like, hey, now I'm going to change my practices. I'm going to now look out for this. And then the exploiters go, okay, well, they've got onto that one. I need to find another way. And we really, in front of our eyes, saw this practice happening. And because we were going from port to port across, we could see how it changed. So at that point, we realized that Apprise captures information, and Apprise Audit captures information which shows the current practices of exploitation. And we started thinking about how we could use technology to do processing of these exploitation patterns to see how things change and see how things, how we can use this information to get a good understanding of like patterns of exploitation, look for new hotspots and look for new practices. There's a whole theory behind this about sentinel surveillance. So it borrows from epidemiology, the study of diseases. And we say, we're all very familiar now with contact tracing and all
we're
of
all
these kinds
amateur
of things.
epidemiologists, I think, nowadays.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So you have passive and active kinds of surveillance. So passive is if I'm a doctor and I just wait for people to come to see me. Active is when I actively go out there and I look for cases of exploitation or cases of a disease. We kind of say, let's think of exploitation and labor exploitation, labor trafficking as a disease. But if we have people who actively go out and they go to places where there's a higher than average chance of coming across people in exploitative conditions, and we teach them or equip them how to diagnose a case. In this case, we say Apprise could be one of those tools that helps people to rapidly assess a case and figure out what the next steps could be. So using sentinel surveillance, this kind of approach that I'm talking about, we can get information, we can collate information, we can understand changing patterns, and then we can perform action based on this. So maybe my action would be better informed inspectors, because now we know much quicker what the new practice of exploitation is. The best case is if we can prevent things from happening in the first case, so we can make policy changes. So maybe we can make a new law that now that we're very aware of how things have changed, we have our new practices, we can make a law to stop them from happening in the first place. Or we could do education and say, guys, from Burma, Burmese speaking people from Myanmar, sorry, when you come across, watch out for this practice, because this is how people are exploiting people from Myanmar going into this sector of work. That is really our hope, to stop people from coming in the first place.
Interesting. Now, Sophie, I'm just guessing that among us, you're the real digital native. I mean, all your life, I presume.
I do love Twitter. Yes.
So from that perspective, right, which I tried to get down with these technologies, but I'm an old guy. So what are your thoughts in terms of this harnessing of what, I guess it's now a bit cliched to call them fourth industrial revolution technologies, but to harness this these new tools for social good, which I think is a really important way of looking at technology, because we hear now a lot about how, especially with elections that have recently happened, how technology has really challenged democracy. But here, this is technology used for real social good. What are your thoughts on that?
I think so. Even just from working with Hannah and Phoebe on this project over the past 4 months, something that sets apart a tech approach to any solution is sort of this paradox of it being extremely adaptable and extremely able to change to sort of fix this cat and mouse catch up that Hannah's describing, but also the fact that it is not a silver bullet solution to a lot of these things, which is something that Hannah and I speak about a lot, right? These are deeply entrenched social problems that Phoebe described in her introduction, and one tech solution, no matter how well we adapt it, is not going to change policy if it's not participating in an ecosystem that's friendly to the change. So people like Phoebe who work with companies to drive that change, and hopefully people like Hannah and I in the academic side who are trying to bring academics more out into the fore about these issues and also integrate more with different policymakers are able to sort of make it a friendly environment. But something I love about working on tech for social good is how we adapt it even in small ways to do that catch up. So for example, we had one of our surveys was translated into English for some of one of the factory sort of like Apprise Audit interview sessions. So if you're a worker, you can select on the app that you want to do the survey in English. And we had some feedback that people didn't understand the English that we used. And it was because we used English using an English, a British accent. And some people that we were speaking to had never heard English spoken that way before. So they didn't identify it as the same language. And so we're able to understand not just how to create and to go back, into the product and adapt so that the worker really has a say in engineering what the product looks like on the back end. But also we're able to get a rich picture of the social texture of the community that we're engaging in a way that academics don't normally have access to, and brands and other, policymakers don't really have the ability to engage with. So tech not only allows us to do this on a sort of individual basis with these anecdotes, but in a larger way, right? We're able to create a broad picture with the rich data sets we have to be able to determine and see kind of what the trends are over time. And that's something, Hannah mentioned already, but I would underscore as being something that tech can uniquely engage with. So I'm definitely a tech advocate and new on Twitter, but a big fan. You should follow us at Apprise Solutions.
All right.
Okay. Link in the bio. Yes,
That's
for
right.
those watching afterwards.
Yes.
But it's been a great way to engage with partners as well and to kind of get the word out. So Hannah and I are big proponents of academics that also are in the world.
Great, thank you very much. Now, Phoebe, this brings us a good segue into talking a bit the broader problem. Sophie is saying that one app alone, technology isn't going to resolve like a major problem that we have, a social and development problem such as modern day slavery. Now, you're a certified anti-money laundering specialist, and you have a background in financial services, specializing in financial crime compliance and anti-money laundering efforts. So where are we in this battle against this scourge? As I know, a book by my friend Ben Skinner, A Crime So Monstrous, right? That is still with us today, and for many people, it's still surprising that there is such a thing as slavery in our midst today.
Yeah, it often is surprising to people. We will often visit banks, even when I was back in the banking world. Modern slavery really wasn't something that was on my mind necessarily, even though I was very much working in the midst of AML, anti-money laundering, that kind of world. I think generally speaking, due to media, due to rhetoric, due to kind of legislation, we were always thinking about drug trafficking. This was like the number one big crime that we need to be combating. But we estimate that modern slavery is generating at least 150 billion US dollars every year. It's a significantly profitable crime. And it's an interesting one because, when you're a drug trafficker, you kind of get your goods, you sell them on, you make your profit. When you're trafficking people, you can exploit that person over and over and over and over and over again and continue to make money just from one individual. So it's really a crime that's driven by this profit. And it's certainly something that needs to be more heavily on the agenda and more heavily spoken about within the finance world. Certainly things are moving in that direction. We're seeing more and more kind of trainings on this issue within banks. We're seeing more kind of high profile cases within the media related to the relationship between modern slavery and finance. And of course, we're seeing emerging legislation that's already in place in the UK and in Australia that's kind of focused on the business relationship between, including banks and between finance and modern slavery, as well as kind of more proposed legislation in the US looking to kind of prosecute those organizations or find those organizations that are seen to be funding modern slavery as well. So certainly things are moving in that direction, but I'd still say there's definitely a ways to go. This is certainly a key area of focus for us at Mekong Club, because ultimately, if we can make this crime unprofitable, then people are going to stop doing it. Currently, they're getting away with it far too easily, which is something that we need to tackle.
Can I quickly follow up? And how do we? Is there any way to measure what progress is being made in dealing with this problem? Or I think it probably redounds to the question of, well, do we even know the extent of the problem? So it's very difficult to then say, well, how much progress are we making in addressing it?
Yeah, I mean, this measuring progress is one of the biggest challenges that we face when tackling such a hidden issue. However, so if we just focus on the finance side of things, certainly we can measure the number of suspicious activity or unusual activity reports related to modern slavery or human trafficking that institutions are raising. So if you work within a bank and you identify something that you think might be unusual or suspicious, there's an internal system. It's essentially like a form that you fill out and you can send to local law enforcement, and then they can then deal with the issue. If banks aren't identifying modern slavery related activities, then it's highly unlikely that law enforcement is going to know about these issues related to finance. So that's one point of measurement. Some places you can see this data, some places you can't. The reality is there's very few, very few of these reports being raised in most locations related to the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking. And I think a big part of this problem is caused by the fact it's just a lack of awareness. If people who are responsible for identifying suspicious activities simply don't know what they're looking at, then we can't expect them to be making these reports. So this is a really interesting area. It's an interesting metric that we actually can measure. Certainly something that we're exploring, but as I say, currently the numbers they're not great.
Yeah. Now,
can
Hannah,
I follow on from that?
Please.
Just to tell you a little bit more from the United Nations side, you have the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. One of them, number 8, looks at decent work, and so target 8.7 looks at eradicating modern slavery, human trafficking, child trafficking, and any forms of exploitation. And so there is a group called Delta 8.7, so measuring a change in 8.7. And that is, I think this officially called the Secretariat of Delta 8.7 is our sister institute, UNU Center for Policy Research, UNU CPR. So they have some country dashboards as well. If you want to have a look, we can always provide you a link to their site to say how are each of the different countries doing at eradicating modern slavery.
Interesting. Well, what was the you can't treasure what you can't measure, you can't appreciate unless you measure something, right?
Yeah.
And so that's always I think an important ways to understand the metrics. So in fact, Hannah, if I can pursue you and Sophie and a colleague, Michael Gallo at UNU Macau, you've been researching frontier technologies potential to combat exploitative employment relationships. And in the midst of COVID-19, which is, of course, wreaking havoc in terms of pushing people back into poverty, and there's a lot more exploitation in the workplace, particularly in remote areas and certain industries. Tell us a bit about that work that you're doing and what you're looking into.
So there's a couple of things with Mike. What I'm doing with Mike is I'm looking at sentinel surveillance. So what I was talking about before. So can we get this kind of information from different sentinel sites? Just analyze it after collating it together, and can we use that information to identify changing practices? Now we understand practices of exploitation have severely changed after COVID-19. People are in far more precarious work situations, and other people who have lost their job are now having to find other work, which again is often even more precarious. So that's the stuff I'm doing with Mike, and then the project I think you're referring to with Sophie and Mike, but also I guess there's a bit of Phoebe in there, is looking at COVID-19 and the way we've been using Apprise Audit in response to the different brands. So I guess it was around March or April, we were approached by some of the multinational corporations who already use Apprise Audit in their own supply chains. And they said to us, we can't actually go in person or move around as easily to do our social compliance audit because, there's lockdown everywhere. So they can't get to the different factories. They asked us to look at how we could adapt Apprise Audit to be able to help them in these situations. So we did two big adaptations. First of all, we made a new list of questions for cases where an auditor is able to get to the factory. And this list contains like maybe half of our normal questions we would ask, but has some additional ones about COVID-19 conditions. So social distancing, being forced to stay in your dormitories, being able to, wash hands and all that kind of stuff. And changes in pay rates. Pay hours, we understand if a factory is now getting less orders, they might have less hours to give to each of the employees. But changing rates of pay, so hourly pay rate is a very different thing. And that goes to payment under minimum wage. So that's one of the investigations we were doing. And so we now have some brands using this around a few different countries. Phoebe can let us know because I always forget which countries they're using it in. The other adaptation we made is we did Apprise Audit remote. So this remote version, we have a way for factories to basically print out a QR code and have some instructions which are in the form of a cartoon strip so that a factory worker can undertake an interview by themselves and without an auditor there. So this isn't my favorite way of getting information because you don't actually know if someone's watching them or if someone's coercing them to respond in a particular way, but at least it's better than nothing. At least you get some information and have a chance for people to have their voice heard.
Yes, interesting. Now, Sophie, what are your thoughts in terms of this project that you're working on?
Yeah, so going off of what Hannah and Phoebe have said, I think something we've been thinking about a lot lately was actually quoted. I think the first time I saw it was in a piece on the Council on Foreign Relations by Richard Haas, who's its director, who spoke about how COVID-19 isn't making change in the world, it's only accelerating pre-existing changes. And I think something we've been talking a lot about, as well as with one of our colleagues based in Hong Kong, who's the head of human and labor rights and governance at Diginex Solutions, which is a technology company. We've been talking about how COVID-19 is kind of accelerating this trend that we've seen from our different backgrounds. So her from, tech only background, us from sort of tech academia, tech for good, and then Phoebe from local civil society work with corporates. We've seen this trend where increasingly corporations want to integrate technology into their auditing process, and COVID-19 sort of only accelerating this trend. And so the four of us are actually working on, and again, we can put the link in the bio when it's out, a think piece about this issue, because for us, it's raising existential questions in all of our fields. Like, what will it really mean to have most of these audits be remote? What is a benefit of an in-person audit that might be kind of taken away, or what can be added when tech is added? So I think going back to Hannah's earlier point about how tech is kind of in the eye of the beholder, whoever creates the solution really has the agency about what it looks like on the ground and what their intentions are manifest in its development. So if we start to develop tech for good that can be used in social compliance auditing, how can that intention basically work to improve the sector? So it's a question I think we're all sort of wrestling with now, and something that I hope, the preliminary study that Hannah's referencing that I'm working on with her and Mike, of what Apprise Audit has done since COVID is going to be one of the few pieces of raw material that we can use to predict not just how this trend will evolve, but how it should evolve while we're in this weird pocket of having some agency to continue what will move it forward. So it's an exciting time for that.
Yes. So you all have been so generous with your time, but I wanted to sort of close by just asking you about your thoughts with the pandemic and how you and your organizations have been coping, how it's changed the way you're working, and what you see kind of going forward as, I mean, Sophie mentions this idea that the pandemic is accelerating sort of trends, but what will change about your work because of COVID-19, and how do you see things going forward? So Phoebe.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it kind of very sadly, we're naturally seeing significantly higher risk of modern slavery in a lot of those kind of key sourcing locations that we work with. Of course, migrant workers hugely at risk, low paid workers hugely at risk, and it seems to be getting worse. However, we are certainly seeing more interest and more engagement from a lot of brands that necessarily before we haven't really had much engagement from. So I think it does hopefully point to a trend of an increased interest in the humanity of a supply chain from both the consumer side and the business side. It seems to be that the pandemic has triggered more of a kind of collective humanity within us all, I hope. There's certainly been more kind of media interest in the impact on supply chains, on the plight of migrant workers, on the conditions of their dormitories, et cetera, et cetera. As this interest grows, we see more interest from the private sector. So for organizations like ourselves at Mekong Club, this is great. We're very much here to engage with those companies that are looking to look into this issue more extensively over the coming years. So that's great. I mean, it's a kind of a double-edged sword, but I'm choosing to kind of see the bright side to this.
I used to teach a course called Humanity in Globalization, which I think is important. I like the idea of your emphasizing this idea of there is humanity in the supply chain, and that's often something we don't see in the search for productivity and efficiency. We forget that achievement of productivity and efficiency can often be on the backs of real people. Hannah, what's looking for? How are you looking at things going forward?
So here in Macau, we have been lucky that I think it's been over 200 days since there was the last case. So like on an everyday basis, it's been a while since we had any real impact on our work, but lots of our work is traveling. So doing field research in different countries. We've had to cancel quite a lot of data collection and kind of put on hold some of our existing studies. It also means that we've been forced to do a bit more embracing of this distance collaboration. Why Sophie is in Hong Kong and not in Macau because she can't cross the border.
Right, yes.
So we have colleagues all around the world. From a computer science perspective, it has actually been a nice push because now quite a lot of people who weren't really thinking about technology are open to considering innovating and inventing new technologies to continue doing what they need to do. So that's a nice shift for us. Just for people to be more receptive to trying something different.
Interesting. Now, Sophie, you're used to being all over the world. I mean, you worked in Jordan, you were in Beijing at Tsinghua. What are your thoughts in terms of COVID? I mean, I know you were affected by COVID because you were studying in Beijing, and I think you had to go remote, as I recall. So what are your thoughts then going forward in terms of the impact of the pandemic, not just on you, but on students really, and education?
Yeah, I guess I can speak to the perspective of sort of migration more broadly, given my 5 years of experience working on and with migrants on different issues, from now in a more tech side to previously working in refugee camps in Jordan. I can see that the way that people have experienced restricted movement over the past couple of months is really influencing the way that people sort of think about where their home is, think about what their communities are, and also has obviously brought these communities to be more digital. But that has only further disenfranchised those folks who don't have the mobility privilege to be able to access technology, which now is associated with mobility, I think, ideologically in a way that it wasn't before. So, for example, I'm a mentor now. I used to study at Schwarzman College in Beijing, and I'm a mentor to the current students. And I have several students who are able to travel to the world, like to meet different scholars as they're all based remotely. And then other students who have to rely on their internet connection, which is not always stable, to be able to complete their coursework. And so I think it's going to harden the resilience of those students who are able to work remotely, and kind of make those students hopefully more interested in the field that Hannah and I work in, of sort of tech for good and tech for development. And I hope that it makes those students who have mobility kind of acknowledge their privilege and acknowledge the ways that folks, especially, from what we work on, that are trapped in modern slavery, don't have mobility from the beginning. That's a huge issue that drives them to sort of stay in their own circumstances and to not be able to look for or imagine new solutions. So hopefully it will push kind of a collective empathy from people that are forced into this digital environment. That's what we can hope for, I suppose.
Great. Thank you, all three of you. It's been lovely to have this conversation. I tell you, Hannah, you mentioned SDG 8, but this, I think, is a concrete example of SDG 17, the whole idea of partnerships, collaboration, because that's kind of what it's all about. And that's my favorite SDG, if one has to choose, right? because that's all the other issues. It's about collaboration. And I think what I think is just so thrilling and fantastic about the work that you all are doing is that this is a collaboration from different fields. And it's truly the future, trying to deal with a problem that has been with us for far too long. And I think this is really, truly fantastic. And I wish you all well, and keep safe, keep healthy. And thank you again for joining us. Now, I commend our listeners and viewers to the article on AsiaGlobal Online by Phoebe, Hannah, and Sophie. Please come to the AsiaGlobal Institute website to sign up for our news and information. Come to the AsiaGlobal Online website, and follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Apprise. Yes, Twitter. Please don't forget that. And the Mekong Club and UNU, all over the world, UNU. They're a great institution. So thank you again, all three of you. Wonderful to see you. Keep safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.